We're going to start our tour of vertebrates with the oldest vertebrates, which are fish. Generally, they're thought to be the first evolved vertebrates on the planet. All fish are aquatic, but they can live in fresh or salt water. There are many, many different types of fish, and we're going to talk about the three major groupings. The first and oldest group of fish are the Agnathans, also known as the jawless fish for obvious reasons because they have no jaw. They do have teeth or tentacles, and they tend to be embedded in a very dense tissue, but it is not bone. Their entire skeleton is made out of cartilage, and that cartilage is soft and decays very fast. That's why you don't see preserved skeletons of these specimens. They have no paired fins, which is significant because all the other groups of fish do. They do have a caudal fin at the end, which we often call a tail fin, and then some also have a dorsal fin. So dorsal, caudal. And then they have gill slits, but no gill covering. They reproduce internally or externally, and they have so they can lay eggs and they can be fertilized that way, or some of the deep sea species actually will fertilize internally so that the female can gather enough sperm and then eventually lay her eggs. One of the most popular and talked about groups is Chondrichthyes. This includes sharks, skates, rays, and chimeras. Chondrichthyes is actually a class, as well as Agnathan, and this group is different from Agnathan in a couple of ways. They are similar in that they have skeletons made out of cartilage. The difference is that they have a jaw, and it's actually made out of hard bone. They also have what's called a lateral line, and you can sort of see the lateral line on this shark. I'm going to circle it for you. It's right above the change in color, which is an adaptation for an open ocean fish. So this lateral line helps them sense prey because it actually senses changes in water pressure. So as something moves in the water, it causes the water pressure to change, and sharks can sense that and then find their prey. They also have denticles, which are their scales. They face backwards, but they're sharp. So most fish that you're familiar with have round scales. Sharks and skates and rays have denticles. So if you pet them, which I don't recommend, from nose to tail, they're smooth. But if you try to go backwards, it feels really rough like sandpaper, and that's because of the shape of those scales. They also have electroreception. They can actually sense the electrical impulses in the muscles of moving fish. So it's another thing that helps them to sense their prey. Sharks, skates, and rays actually have paired fins, unlike Agnathans. So they actually have two of some of the fins, and those are mainly the pectoral fins and the pelvic fins. On a skate or a ray, those pectoral fins are actually very large and wide, and they don't have any pelvic fins, and they often won't have any anal fins. On a skate or ray, also, the tail is no longer needed for swimming, so the tail tends to be very small, and it's adapted to be defensive. So it's a whip, or sometimes they contain poisonous barbs, and it can be a defense for an animal that's oftentimes easily stepped on in the sand. Sharks, skates, and rays have gill slits with no covering. They have internal reproduction, but they can lay their eggs externally, which is what most rays will do. Or if it's an open ocean shark, they lay them internally, and it looks like they give live birth, but they actually lay multiple eggs. It's just that whichever one hatches first eats all of the others. Lovely fact about sharks. They also have excellent energy conservation. They can actually conserve their energy by moving really slow, except when they're ready to strike. They use large oil-filled liver to control their buoyancy so that they don't have to worry about swimming so much, although there are a couple of exceptions, hammerheads being one. They have to constantly swim. They also have their pectoral fins tend to be angled for lift, which allows them to spend less energy trying to swim through the water. It's a little bit like angled airplane wings for lift. Cartilage is also lighter than bone, and so they don't actually have to spend that much energy trying to control their buoyancy that way. They don't have to feed very often. When they do, they tend to take advantage of whatever large meal is available. And sharks will actually take a bite of anything to see if it's food. It's thought that most sharks don't actually like the taste of humans because most of the time they will take a bite but not finish. There are a couple of exceptions, such as tiger sharks. The biggest group of fish is the group called Osteichthyes, which is often called a superclass of fish, which is split into two classes called lobe-finned fish or lungfish and ray-finned fish. This is a picture of a ray-finned fish, just FYI. I'm not going to actually test you on the difference. But this group is really large. Majority of the fish out there are in class or superclass Osteichthyes, and they actually have a hard bony skeleton. So almost their entire skeleton is made out of hard calcified bone, unlike Agnathans and Chondrichthyes, which have cartilage skeletons. Many Osteichthyes will also have a swim bladder, the exception to that being deep sea fish. A swim bladder actually helps control buoyancy. And buoyancy is the ability to control what level you're at in the water. So fish and all marine organisms have the unique problem of having to control where they are in 3 dimensions rather than in basically 2. We just walk on the ground. They have to swim in 3 different dimensions. These guys also have a lateral line. You can see it right there. Oop, let me switch colors. And that one doesn't work either. There we go. So you can see it right there. The lateral line in these fish generally tends to be more for sensing prey or predators, whereas in sharks it's for sensing prey. And then we have paired fins. So you can see that we have 2 pelvic fins and there's 2 pectoral fins, one on either side. There's generally only 1 anal fin, 1 caudal fin, and there are 2 dorsal fins, but they're not paired. One often looks very different from the other. These types of fish also have what is called an operculum, which is a gill cover. So it's a flap of scaly skin that actually covers the gills and protects them, although not from parasites. There's lots of parasites in there. They have a mouth, and they often have teeth, but they tend to be pretty small, and of course 2 eyes. Oops, I forgot to write it, but the reproduction for these guys is some internal, but mostly external, where the female lays the eggs and the male fertilizes the eggs where they lay. However, open ocean fish can't lay their eggs because they would sink to the deep ocean and most likely die. So most open ocean fish actually have internal reproduction and internally lay their eggs. They still don't have live birth. Generally, Osteichthyes produce hundreds to thousands of offspring at any one time, but they are very underdeveloped. You should have learned last year in biology that this is actually a strategy for survival. So over the next week, you need to be able to identify fish by their major grouping, Agnatha, Chondrichthyes, or Osteichthyes. You are going to use a dichotomous key to identify fish by their families, and then talk about their relationships, which are more closely related. You're also going to dissect a fish, probably a mackerel, which is a small surf fish, to examine the internal anatomy of Osteichthyes. And then you're also going to need to be able to compare the 3 major groups. So what do they have in common, and what do they have that's different?